The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on the overturned stagecoach, its wooden wheels spinning lazily in the hot wind that swept across the endless prairie. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows dancing across the scattered belongings and broken dreams littering the dusty ground. Sarah Mae Whitmore pressed her face against the scorching earth, tasting blood and grit between her teeth. Her elegant Boston dress, once a deep emerald green, was now torn and stained with dust and crimson. The corset that had once made her feel dignified now felt like iron bands crushing her ribs with each labored breath. "Help," she whispered to the empty sky, but her voice was little more than a rasp. The bandits had taken everything: the strongbox, the mail, even Mrs. Henderson's precious locket. They'd left the passengers for dead, and from what Sarah could see, they'd succeeded. With everyone but her. 3 days. It had been 3 days since the attack, and she was dying by degrees. The water from her canteen had run out yesterday, and the relentless sun was slowly cooking the life from her bones. She thought of Boston, of the comfortable parlor where she used to take tea with the ladies' auxiliary. That life seemed like a dream, now a beautiful, impossible dream that had shattered the moment. She discovered Thomas's gambling debts and the dangerous men who came calling. "I should have stayed," she murmured, remembering the night she'd fled. The letter had been clear. They wanted their money, and if Thomas couldn't pay, they'd take it out of his wife's hide. But Thomas was already 6 feet under, buried in a pauper's grave after his heart gave out from the stress. Sarah had nothing left to give them but her life. A shadow fell across her face, and for a moment she thought the vultures had finally grown bold enough to descend. But when she opened her eyes, she saw boots-worn leather boots with silver spurs that caught the sunlight. "Please," she gasped, squinting up at the figure towering above her. The man was tall and lean, silhouetted against the blazing sky like some dark angel. His hat brim cast his face in shadow, but she could see a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He knelt beside her without a word, his movements careful and deliberate. His hands were gentle as he turned her head, checking for injuries with the practiced ease of someone who'd seen plenty of violence. When he reached for his canteen, Sarah nearly wept with relief. "Easy now," he said quietly, supporting her head as she drank. His voice was rough from disuse, as if he didn't speak often. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. Sarah studied his face as she drank. He was perhaps 35, with weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something haunted in those eyes, a pain that seemed to match her own. His clothes were practical worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A Colt .45 hung low on his hip, and she noticed the way his hand never strayed far from it. "Thank you," she whispered when she'd had enough. I thought I was going to die here." He nodded, but didn't respond, his eyes scanning the wreckage around them. Sarah watched as he moved with quiet efficiency, checking the other bodies and gathering what supplies he could salvage. There was something almost reverent in the way he closed the eyes of the dead, as if he understood the weight of such moments. "I'm Sarah," she said, trying to sit up. "Sarah Mae Whitmore." The man paused in his work and looked at her for a long moment. She had the strange feeling he was measuring her somehow, deciding whether she was worth the effort. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed oddly formal given the circumstances. "Jake," he said simply, then went back to his work. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake fashioned a travois from pieces of the broken stagecoach. Sarah tried to protest when he lifted her onto it. She was perfectly capable of walking, she insisted, but her legs betrayed her the moment she tried to stand. "I can pay you," she said as they began moving across the prairie. "When we reach the next town, I can wire my bank in Boston." I have money there, enough to make it worth your while. Jake's only response was a slight shake of his head. Sarah wasn't sure if he was declining her offer or simply indicating that payment wasn't necessary. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the travois and the steady clip-clop of his horse's hooves as they traveled. Sarah found herself studying her rescuer more closely. There was something compelling about his quiet presence, a sense of strength that went beyond his physical appearance. He moved like a man comfortable with solitude, someone who'd learned to find peace in the vast emptiness of the frontier. "Are you taking me to town?" she asked after they'd been traveling for an hour. No. A single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat. Then where? Safe place. His answers were frustratingly brief, but something in his tone convinced her to trust him. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was the gentle way he'd given her water, but she found herself relaxing despite her circumstances. The landscape around them was both beautiful and terrible endless. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush, and prairie grass, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. "It's so empty," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Jake. "Good for thinking," he replied, and she caught something in his voice that suggested he'd done plenty of both being alone and thinking. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been impossible to imagine back in Boston, Jake stopped beside a small creek that wound its way through a grove of cottonwoods. The trees provided blessed shade, and the sound of running water was like music after the endless silence of the prairie. Jake helped her down from the travois with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown before. As he made camp building a small fire, setting out bedrolls, preparing coffee in a battered tin pot, Sarah watched him work and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "Why did you help me?" she asked as they sat by the fire, sharing beans from a can and drinking bitter coffee that tasted better than any she'd had in Boston's finest restaurants. Jake stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Found a woman once, dying like you were. Didn't make it in time." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I'm sorry." He nodded, but didn't elaborate, and Sarah understood that some wounds were too deep for casual conversation. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, bright and clear in a way that city dwellers could never imagine. "What happened to you?" Jake asked suddenly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. Sarah hesitated. The truth was dangerous. The men who wanted her dead had long arms and deep pockets. But something about Jake's quiet presence made her want to be honest. "My husband owed money to very bad people," she said finally. "When he died, they decided I should pay his debts." Jake looked at her then, and she saw understanding in his storm-gray eyes. "Running away." "Yes." "Good," he said simply, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the lack of judgment in his voice. As they prepared for sleep, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she felt safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, she was alive and protected. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd lain dying in the dust just hours before. The Morrison ranch sat in a valley between two rolling hills, hidden from the main trail by design rather than accident. Sarah's first glimpse of it came as they crested the eastern ridge in the soft light of dawn, and she couldn't help but gasp at the sight. It was modest, but well-maintained, a single-story log house with a wide front porch, a small barn, and a corral that held 3 horses. What struck her most was how perfectly it seemed to belong to the landscape, as if it had grown from the earth itself rather than been built by human hands. "It's beautiful," she said, and Jake nodded slightly, though she caught a flicker of something pride, perhaps in his eyes. "Been here 5 years," he said, as they descended toward the house. "Built most of it myself." The interior of the house was as practical as its owner, clean, sparse, but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with books that surprised Sarah with their variety. She spotted everything from practical farming manuals to volumes of poetry, all well worn from use. "You can have the bedroom," Jake said, indicating a door off the main room. "I'll take the porch." "I couldn't," Sarah began, but Jake had already turned away, busying himself with preparations for breakfast. The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a quilt that looked handmade. A washstand held a ceramic pitcher and bowl, and there was even a small mirror on the wall. After days in the desert, it looked like luxury beyond measure. Over the following days, a routine developed between them. Jake would rise before dawn to tend his animals and check his small herd of cattle, while Sarah gradually took over the household tasks despite his protests. She found a strange peace in the simple domestic work, cooking meals, mending clothes, tending the small vegetable garden behind the house. Her strength returned slowly but steadily under Jake's quiet care. He never pressed her for details about her past, never asked uncomfortable questions, but she often caught him watching her with those stone gray eyes, as if trying to solve some complex puzzle. "You don't talk much," Sarah observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Jake shrugged. "Nothing much to say." "It wasn't always like that, was it?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Had a family once. Wife, little girl. They're gone now." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy. "The woman you mentioned? The one you couldn't save in time?" "My wife, Emma, and our daughter, Lucy." She was 4. Jake's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Raiders hit the place while I was in town. Came back to find." He stopped, unable to finish. "Oh, Jake." Sarah reached out instinctively and covered one of his hands with hers. He didn't pull away, but she felt the tension in his muscles. "Swore I'd never let it happen again. To anyone." The weight of his pain was almost overwhelming, and Sarah understood now why he lived alone, why he spoke so little, why he'd saved her without asking for anything in return. He was trying to balance some cosmic scale to atone for a failure that wasn't his fault. "How long ago?" she asked gently. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days. The precision of his answer broke her heart. She squeezed his hand, wishing she could find words that would ease his suffering. "I was married too," she said quietly. "Thomas." He was. He was a good man who made terrible choices. The gambling started small, friendly games with other businessmen, but it grew into something monstrous. It consumed everything we had. Jake looked at her then, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the understanding of one lost soul recognizing another. "He tried to stop," she continued, "many times. But they kept pulling him back in, promising easy money, extending more credit. By the end, he owed $30,000 to men who collect debts with violence." "30,000," Jake repeated, whistling low. "That's serious money. Serious enough to kill for." Thomas's heart gave out from the stress, but they didn't care. "They came to the house 3 days after the funeral, told me I inherited his obligations, along with everything else." Sarah shuddered, remembering the cold eyes of the men who'd sat in her parlor, drinking her tea while discussing her future like she wasn't there. "So you ran." "I sold everything I could quickly and quietly, bought passage west under a false name. I thought distance would be enough." She laughed bitterly. "I was foolish. Men like that have long memories and longer reach." "They won't find you here," Jake said with quiet certainty. "How can you be sure?" "Because I won't let them." The simple declaration carried more weight than any elaborate promise could have. Sarah believed him completely, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly safe. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to see changes in Jake as well. He still spoke sparingly, but his silences seemed less painful, more companionable. He smiled occasionally, small, fleeting expressions that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. And sometimes, in unguarded moments, she caught him humming while he worked. The ranch itself began to show signs of a woman's touch. Sarah planted wildflowers along the front porch, organized Jake's books by subject, and even convinced him to let her hang curtains in the windows. The changes were small, but they made the house feel more like a home. "You're good at this," Jake observed one evening, watching her put the finishing touches on an apple pie cooling on the windowsill. "At what?" "Making a place feel lived in." Emma was like that too. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife's name without pain shadowing his features, and Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For saving me, for giving me a place to heal for." She struggled to find the right words. "For not making me feel like a burden." Jake looked genuinely surprised. "You're not a burden. You're—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You've brought life back to this place. Light." The admission hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to explore. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with cleaning up the kitchen. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed that had become familiar and comfortable, Sarah found herself thinking about the future for the first time in months. Not the immediate future, whether she'd survive the next day or the next week, but the distant future. What kind of life might be possible in this hidden valley with this quiet, damaged man who'd saved her body and was slowly healing her soul? The thought should have frightened her. She'd known Jake for less than a month, and her last experience with marriage had ended in disaster. But there was something about his steady presence, his quiet strength, that made her feel safe in ways she'd never experienced before. Outside her window, she could hear Jake moving around on the porch, preparing his bedroll for another night under the stars. She wondered if he was thinking about the future too, or if he was still too trapped in the past to imagine anything beyond the next sunrise. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the gentle lowing of cattle, whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the soft rhythm of Jake's breathing as he settled into sleep. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. But peace, as she would soon learn, was a fragile thing on the frontier. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late July, when Jake returned from checking his cattle with worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Someone's been asking questions in town," he said without preamble, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Sarah's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. "What kind of questions?" "About a woman matching your description. Well-dressed Eastern lady, traveling alone." Jake's eyes met hers across the kitchen. "Two men, city clothes, expensive horses. They're staying at the Cattleman's Hotel." The blood drained from Sarah's face. She'd known this day would come, but somehow she'd allowed herself to believe that the hidden valley might protect her forever. Her hands began to shake, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "How did they find me?" she whispered. "Money talks," Jake said grimly. "Probably been following your trail since Denver, buying information from stagecoach drivers, hotel clerks, anyone who might have seen you." Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of inevitability crushing down her shoulders. "I should leave. Tonight. If I go now, maybe they won't connect me to you." "No." The single word carried absolute finality. "Jake, you don't understand. These men, I understand plenty." Jake moved to the window, his hand resting instinctively on his gun. "And I meant what I said. They won't take you. There are two of them, and you're just one man. I'm not just one man." Jake turned from the window, and Sarah saw something dangerous flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "I'm the man who's been waiting 3 years for someone to threaten what's mine." A possessive note in his voice sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with fear. She'd never heard Jake speak with such intensity, such barely controlled violence. "Tell me about them," Jake continued, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone. "Everything you know." Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details she'd tried to forget. "The leader is Marcus Donovan. He's maybe 40, well-dressed, soft-spoken. But his eyes," she shuddered, "he enjoys causing pain. The other one is Tommy Kellamjunger, maybe 25, but mean as a snake. He does Donovan's dirty work." "They killed before?" "Thomas wasn't their first debtor to die of a convenient heart attack," Sarah said quietly. "And there were stories. Women who couldn't pay their husbands' debts and simply disappeared." Jake nodded grimly. "Professional killers, then. That actually makes it easier." "Easier? How is that easier?" "Because professionals have patterns. They think they're smarter than everyone else, especially frontier folk. Makes them predictable." Jake moved to a cabinet and pulled out a second gun belt, checking the loads in a matching Colt .45. "How much do they know about me?" "Nothing, I hope. I used a false name on the stage, and no one in town knows about us. Good. That gives us an advantage." Jake strapped on the second gun belt, and Sarah realized she was seeing a different man than the quiet rancher who'd saved her. This was someone harder, more dangerous, someone who'd learned violence in a harsh school. "What are you planning?" "Nothing complicated. They'll come here eventually, probably tomorrow night, when they think we're asleep. Men like that prefer to work in darkness." "And when they do?" Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. "I'll be waiting." The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Jake checked and rechecked his weapons, while Sarah tried to focus on normal activities and failed completely. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow at the window sent her heart racing. As evening approached, Jake made his final preparations. He positioned spare rifles at strategic points around the house, checked that all the shutters were secure, and laid out extra ammunition within easy reach. "I want you to stay in the bedroom," he told Sarah as they ate a dinner neither could taste. "There's a rifle under the bed and a box of shells in the knitstand. If something happens to me—" "Don't." Sarah reached across the table and grasped his hand. "Don't talk like that. If something happens to me," Jake continued firmly, "you take the rifle and head for the hills. There's a cave about 2 miles north, hidden behind a waterfall. You can hide there until they give up looking. I won't leave you. You will if I tell you to." Jake's voice brooked no argument. "Promise me." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that they face this together, but the look in Jake's eyes told her this was non-negotiable. "I promise," she whispered. They spent the evening in the main room, Jake cleaning his guns while Sarah tried to read. But the words swam on the page, and she found herself watching him instead. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he handled his weapons, a familiarity that spoke of long experience with violence. "You weren't always a rancher, were you?" she asked quietly. Jake looked up from the Colt he was reassembling. "No, I was a lot of things before I came here. Soldier, scout, lawman for a while." His hands never paused in their work. "Did some things I'm not proud of. For Emma and Lucy. For them. For money. For reasons that seemed important at the time." Jake holstered the clean weapon and picked up the second one. "A man does what he has to do to survive. And now?" Jake met her eyes across the room. "Now I'm protecting what matters most." The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She understood now that this wasn't just about keeping a promise to a dying woman, wasn't just about Jake's need for redemption. Somehow, over the past month, she'd become important to him in ways neither of them had expected. "Jake," she began, but he held up a hand. "Listen." Sarah strained her ears and heard it, the distant sound of horses moving carefully through the darkness. 2 riders approaching from the east, trying to muffle the sound of their approach. "It's time," Jake said, rising smoothly to his feet. "Remember what I told you?" Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Jake moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. "They're dismounting by the corral," he reported quietly. "Probably think they're being clever, approaching on foot." "Be careful," Sarah whispered. Jake turned from the window and crossed to her in 3 quick strides. Before she could react, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, deep, desperate, and full of everything they'd been too afraid to say out loud. "Whatever happens," he murmured against her lips, "know that these past weeks have been the best of my life." Then he was gone, moving toward the bedroom door like a ghost. Sarah heard the soft click of the latch, and she was alone with her fear and her racing heart. Outside, she could hear careful footsteps circling the house. The hunters had become the hunted, but they didn't know it yet. Sarah gripped the rifle Jake had left her and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. In the darkness beyond the walls, death was stalking closer with every heartbeat. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah wasn't facing it alone. Jake was out there, moving through the shadows with deadly purpose, ready to protect what had somehow become precious to both of them. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, and Sarah held her breath, waiting for the storm to break. The first shot shattered the night silence like thunder, followed immediately by a scream of pain and rage. Sarah pressed herself against the bedroom wall, rifle clutched to her chest. As chaos erupted outside, "Where is she, Morrison?" Marcus Donovan's cultured voice carried clearly through the log walls, though it was strained with pain. "We know she's here." Jake's response was another gunshot, and Sarah heard running footsteps and cursing. She moved carefully to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. In the moonlight, she could see Donovan crouched behind the water trough, clutching his left shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, black in the pale light. "You made a mistake coming here." Jake's voice came from somewhere near the barn, calm and deadly. "The only mistake was underestimating frontier trash," Donovan snarled. "Tommy, circle around behind." "Tommy's not going anywhere," Jake replied, and Sarah noticed he'd moved again, his voice now coming from a different direction. "Take a look." By the corral, Donovan's head turned, and Sarah saw his face go pale. Even from her limited vantage point, she could make out a dark shape sprawled motionless near the fence. "You killed him," Donovan whispered, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine fear. "He drew first. I just drew faster." Sarah watched Donovan's face cycle through fear, rage, and finally calculation. He was a survivor, she realized, the kind of man who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. "How much?" Donovan called. "Out. Name your price, Morrison." "The woman's worth 30,000 to me, but I'll pay 40 for her return." "She's not for sale." 50,000. "Think about what that could buy you out here." "I'm thinking about what you'll buy with a bullet," Jake replied, and Sarah heard the deadly promise in his voice. Donovan was quiet for a long moment, presumably weighing his options. Sarah knew he was trapped, wounded, alone, facing a man who clearly knew these surroundings better than he did. But men like Donovan didn't surrender easily. "You know who I am, Morrison? Who I work for. Kill me, and there'll be 10 more to take my place. Then I'll kill them too." The simple certainty in Jake's voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. This was the man who'd been hidden beneath the quiet rancher's exterior, someone who'd learned violence and learned it well. "Sarah," Donovan suddenly shouted. "Sarah Whitmore. I know you're listening. Come out now, and I'll make it quick. Stay hidden, and I promise you'll watch your protector die slowly before I take you back to Boston." Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle. She could end this now, could walk out and surrender herself to save Jake's life. But even as the thought formed, she knew Jake would never forgive her for it. And more than that, she realized she was tired of running, tired of living in fear. "Sarah Whitmore died in that stagecoach attack," she called out, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "My name is Sarah Morrison now." She heard Jake's sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the darkness, and her heart swelled. With the rightness of the name, Morrison, it felt like coming home. Donovan laughed bitterly. "Touching, but names don't change debts, girl. You still owe $30,000, and I always collect." "The debt died with Thomas," Sarah replied. "I don't owe you anything." "The law might disagree. The law's not here," Jake interrupted. "Just me, and I'm done talking." What happened next was over in seconds. Sarah heard the scrape of boot leather on wood, a curse, 2 shots fired almost simultaneously, and then silence. "Jake?" She called out, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then she heard his voice, tight with pain but alive, wonderfully, beautifully alive. "It's over, Sarah. You can come out." She found him sitting against the side of the house, pressing a bloody bandana to his left arm. Donovan lay 20 feet away, face down in the dirt, his expensive suit torn and dusty. "How bad?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside Jake and gently moving his hand to examine the wound. "Bullet went clean through. I'll live." Jake winced as she probed the injury. "Though I might need some of that nursing you're so good at." "That can be arranged," Sarah said, relief making her almost giddy. "But first we need to get you inside and clean this properly." As she helped Jake to his feet, he glanced toward Donovan's still form. "You meant what you said? About the name?" Sarah looked up at him, seeing past the blood and pain to the hope. In his storm-gray eyes, "I meant it, if you'll have me." "Sarah Morrison," Jake said quietly, testing the sound. "I like it." "Good," she said, sliding her arm around his waist to support him. "Because I'm not going anywhere." 3 months later, Sarah stood on the front porch of the Morrison ranch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The wildflowers she'd planted had bloomed into a riot of color, and the vegetable garden was heavy with the promise of harvest. Jake emerged from the barn, having finished the morning chores despite her protests that his arm wasn't fully healed yet. He moved with his old, quiet confidence, but there was something different about him now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. "Coffee's ready," Sarah called out, and Jake smiled, one of those full, transformative smiles that still took her breath away. "In a minute," he replied, climbing the steps to join her on the porch. "I want to watch this with you." They stood together in comfortable silence, Jake's good arm around Sarah's waist, watching the sun climb over the eastern hills. It was a sight Sarah had seen hundreds of times now, but it never got old. Each sunrise felt like a promise, a reminder that they'd survived the darkness and emerged into light. "Any regrets?" Jake asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about her old life in Boston, the elegant parties, the fine clothes, the social obligations that had once seemed so important. Then she looked around at the simple ranch, at the man beside her, at the life they were building together from scratch. "Only one," she said finally. Jake's arm tightened around her. "What's that? Bet it took so long to find you." Jake laughed, sound that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. "Worth the wait," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Later that morning, as Sarah worked in the garden and Jake repaired a section of fence, she found herself thinking about the future again. Not with the desperate hope of someone trying to escape the past, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found where she belonged. They'd talked about expanding the ranch, maybe raising horses along with cattle. Jake had mentioned the possibility of a trip to Denver come spring to make their marriage legal in the eyes of the law as well as in their hearts. And sometimes, late at night, when they held each other close, they talked about children little. Voices to fill the quiet spaces, small hands to help with the chores, the next generation to carry on what they were building. "Sarah," Jake called from across the yard, "come look at this." She set down her weeding tools and walked over to where he was working. In the distance, a small herd of wild horses was grazing peacefully in the meadow beyond their property line. "They come through every few weeks," Jake explained, sliding his arm around her waist. "Emma always said they were a good sign, meant the land was healthy, that there was enough to share." Sarah leaned into his warmth, watching the horses move with fluid grace across the prairie. "What do you think they mean now?" Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft with wonder. "I think they mean we're home." As the wild horses moved on toward the distant mountains, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The woman who'd fled Boston in terror was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place, but a person. And that person was standing beside her now, solid and real and forever. The past was buried with the men who'd tried to destroy them. The future stretched ahead like an open road, full of possibilities and promise. And the present, this moment, this man, this life they'd built from nothing, was more beautiful than any dream she'd ever dared to. Imagine Sarah Morrison smiled and headed back to her garden, ready to tend the seeds of the life she'd chosen to grow.